Hello guys, thanks for watching. In this video, we're going to focus on the French and Indian War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War. The important thing about this war is it really sets up the context for how the American Revolution starts. It sets up the situation for why the need for taxes and the anger and resentment that's going to begin to develop between the colonies and Great Britain and Parliament and the Crown. First, like always, let's start with the objective. The objective is explain the cause and effects of the 7 Years' War, otherwise known as the French and Indian War. My thesis: the French and Indian War created a set of circumstances and consequences from an already ongoing conflict between the French and their Native American allies in the American Western Territories. However, the end of the war will present itself with all new conflicts for the British Empire that will lead to the American Revolution. So in this class, when we talk about war, we really don't focus necessarily on the war itself. It is important historically, but in terms of this kind of class, where it covers an entire history of a country, we focus more on the impact or what caused the war and the effects of the war itself. We still talk about some aspects of the war, but mostly, what happened before the war, leading up to it, the war's impact on society, on culture, on economics, and the effects of that war. First, let's talk about how this war started. The French and British were competing for alliances in the colonies. The French had a lot of Native American allies, and the British had a few, one of them the Iroquois. But the French controlled large swaths of land. As you can see by the map in the shade of purple here, that you actually have the French controlling a large part of the North American continent. And they control it with their Indian allies. So the western frontier, especially the Ohio River Valley, was a major point of contention between the British and the French. The Iroquois had their sovereignty respected by the English, so they allied with the English. But French and their allies fought with the Iroquois as well. The Ohio Company, which was a Virginia company, basically contracted with the colony of Virginia to a land grant. But this land grant was also claimed by the French, and also was claimed by a rival company in Pennsylvania and land speculators. So this was a big point of contention, not just between the British and French, but also between colonies as well. And if you guys recall from the last video, land is important. Land is the right to vote. Land is economic independence. So for these colonists, land is really, really, really important to have. So this is pushing this idea of westward expansion even further because it's their livelihood and it's their political right. They feel, most people feel, a lot of people feel, it is their necessity to own land. It is their right. But this land in the West is claimed by lots of different interests. So to put some further context into what's going to happen here, you have to understand that the British have been fighting the French and the Spanish for almost the entire 18th century. You have a series of world wars that took place between England, France, and Spain. You have the War of the Spanish Succession, otherwise known as Queen Anne's War, between 1702 to 1713. You have the War of Jenkins' Ear, between 1739 and 1742. And yes, it is called the War of Jenkins' Ear. You have King George's War, 1740 to 1748. But every time a war is fought, you have an increase in debt. War is expensive. War carries a heavy price. It costs a lot of money to fight a war back then and today. So the national debt rose, and you have the people in England itself paying very high taxes, and the people in England are getting angrier and angrier about having to pay those taxes. And so you have a lot of resentment against the crown and parliament at this time because they're increasing taxes so much. So this is the context going into 1754, and the beginning of the French and Indian War in the colonies. So let's talk about the spark. Let's talk about what set this war off. The 1700s, you have George Washington here, very young George Washington in 1754. And George Washington is contracted by the Ohio Company to go ahead and try and discourage the French from building forts along the Ohio River Valley. But unfortunately for George Washington, he was outmatched. He quickly built what was called Fort Necessity. But in that conflict, he lost a third of his men and he had to surrender to the French and Indian forces. Around the same time, you have General Edward Braddock. He was ambushed by French and Indian forces and lost 2/3 of 3,000 soldiers. This war escalated for 2 years, and it was in the favor of the French. England would have to intervene, sparking a global conflict called the 7 Years' War. So at home in 1754, it would be called the French and Indian War, but on a global scale, it would be called the 7 Years' War. And this is truly a world war. You have parts of Eurasia, parts of Africa, all the colonies involved in this fight. And again, just like those previous wars, this war is going to cost England lots of money. So remember this concept. Throughout the 18th century, England is fighting these wars, and these wars are costing England a lot of money. The end of the war, you have the Peace of Paris in 1763, And the British finally turned the tide and won, obviously. And at the end of it, the French had to leave North America, and they ceded all of Florida and Canada to Great Britain. So you see the maps change. Now, this area that once belonged to the French, all the area east of the Mississippi River, belongs to the British. There's one big problem with the Peace of Paris Treaty. The French gave this territory to the British, but the Native American allies to the French will say they were not advised. No one consulted the Native Americans, the French allies, about this territory. And they would claim that the French gave away territory that did not belong to them. So the Indians saw the British now as a threat to their freedom. Indians were mostly allies to the French, not the British. So you have the beginnings of rebellion and conflict now, because now the colonists feel, yay, we can go out west and get land. We've won this war, and they begin to do so, agitating things with Native Americans. So you have what's called Pontiac's Rebellion. It was named after Pontiac, but it really wasn't his rebellion. It was a series of Native American conflicts and fights between colonists and Native Americans. And again, the British had to come in and stop this rebellion. They had to stop the Native Americans and the colonists from fighting. And at this point, the British Crown and Parliament are tired of colonists causing problems and causing conflict and escalating things, and the British Empire is already in debt. It's already up to its head in having to pay for these wars. And so they say, let's stop this, let's nip it in the bud, and let's stop these colonists from going west and causing problems with Native Americans and causing more conflict, and we're having to intervene militarily at our own expense. So what the British did was they formed a proclamation line along the Appalachian Mountains and said, from this point forward, even though the British have everything east of the Mississippi River, colonists are not going to be allowed to go west of the Appalachian Mountains because they didn't want any further conflict with Native Americans. It would be controlled by the British Crown. And colonists are angry. Colonists are angry because they feel they've won the French and Indian War. We got what we wanted. We got this land. Let's go take it. So they're really angry. A lot of colonists are really angry at the Crown for stopping them from going west. they don't really stop them. Colonists go anyway, and they basically ignore the law. And this angers speculators too. Speculators were really trying to sell land, and now they cut into their ability to make money. So now you have this anger after the French and Indian War. So in closing, the French and Indian War is really going to expose some conflicts now between the British colonists and Parliament and the government of the British Empire. And these now are the seeds planting for the American Revolution. Remember, the expense of the war is the Parliament's going to decide, well, if the colonists want protection from the British military, the British, Navy, then they're going to have to pay for the costs. In the next video, we'll go into the beginnings of conflict and the beginnings of the revolution. Thank you for watching, and thank you for